We got a historical perspective here also on the long-term implications of missionizing and politics. We have about 25 minutes for questions, so I'm happy to make a list. If you would like to ask a question, just raise your hand, please. Please.
This question for Professor Becker. I've seen that after, in the 20s, the same period of time, you're talking about some Syrians or Lebanese call themselves Phoenicians. Now, I thought that was a historical nationalist phenomenon, but fairly recently, some Syrian refugees in the Boston area have taken to calling themselves Phoenicians. And asked him about this. He says because they don't want us where we're from. You know, in other words, it's like a new nationalism, but in another country now. Could you say something about that?
I think especially because the way the Middle East is imagined as this place that's really old. I mean, it is a place that's really old, but the way it's imagined since the 19th century as this, the cradle of civilization, all these kinds of cliches for being old. As nationalism developed, there was, and this was an attempt to actually get beyond religious difference by going before Islam. Certain historical ethnic identities were retrieved and articulated. And you can see this in kind of Coptic nationalism, in Phoenicianism. You can see also Greek nationalism. You can see it in some of the strange things in the early Republican period in Turkey and Turkish nationalism. But I think part of this, it's the kind of, I think nationalism in general always likes to have that kind of long story, but it's a way of getting beyond religious difference. With regard to the recent people, it may also be something like not wanting to identify themselves as Arabs because of Islamophobia and the kind of linkages of Arab Muslim. So I think you can see this in the early 80s with the Iranian population of the United States. Iranians often call themselves Persians as a way to avoid, like, I'm not from there because there's so much anti-Iranian sentiment. Yeah, it's interesting that they're doing this now, this Phoenicianism. Is it linked to a prior one, or is it just something new?
Well, that's why I was surprised by it, because I knew about it from the 19-teens and 20s,
Yeah.
like also Syrians, but now that's what surprised me.
It's still they're in Lebanon today. So there's a kind of people will talk about being Phoenician, I think, in that way. And it's a way to say, let's not talk about religion. We're all the same group of people. It ends up creating new problems because, so for example, the Syrian identity created all these problems in the East Syrian community, and then also doesn't connect with Arab nationalism. And so it ends up creating new social differences that become contested.
Can I jump in with a couple of I follow up actually on something that Professor Olupona said earlier. You raised the question, some people have asked you, to what do we owe Syrian refugees, or in the name of solidarity? And I think one of the things we have to be aware of is the dangers of seeming to help, in quotation marks, based on historical experiences. And the history of Christian relations, including the histories of Christian or Western imperialism, for which the memories are very strong, and therefore the possibility of endangering people that we may think we are trying to help. So that then becomes an ethical issue. And that reminds me then I have a question, if I could, for Adam, which is thinking about the importance of the Assyrian community in Chicago. Like, we're right in the epicenter of it, and I'm wondering if you can also say something about them and their history and how they represent the unexpected linkages and the off-site presence of Assyrians in the United States and the world.
I can't say much about it. Is there anyone actually from Chicago who knows much about the Assyrian community? Because I'm not.
Isn't this their big epicenter?
It's the big epicenter, and there's like an Assyrian bookstore in the north side, which if I had scheduled things, I'd like to go visit someday.
I've just heard about it, but I don't know anything about the community here.
The Assyrian identity is really complex because, for example, to just put it very simply, if an Assyrian can convert to Islam, but it's an ethnic identity. So, if I were like Italian, I could maybe, I don't know, maybe I couldn't convert to Islam, but I still might be fine. There's this notion that like Assyrianness it's an ethnic identity, but it requires being Christian. And there are all types of contradictions in this. And how it plays out in the Assyrian community in an interesting way in Iraq is that the Assyrians tended to be more of a political problem like the Kurds in Ba'athist Iraq because they didn't identify as Arabs. Whereas the Chaldeans, which are a different ethnic group but just basically Catholic, it's just the Catholic Assyrians but with a different ethnicity, identified as Arabs, and so they were Christian Arabs. So there's two different ethnic identities. One is with the dominant and fit in. And so the Christian Arab, people who identify as Christian Arab tended to be the Catholic Unionists, whereas the people who are Assyrian tend to be non-Unionists. And it's the same church historically, the same people, but because of how things unfolded, it's put them in very different political positions vis-a-vis Arab nationalism. But yeah, the Assyrian stuff, yeah, I don't know much about it. It's been here for a long time. The Assyrians, the Assyrian community were coming in by the late 19th century.
So we have three more questions. Aaron Hollander was first, I think.
Thank you. Thank you both for such rich and helpful discussions. My question for Sharkey. One element I didn't hear you speak about, but I'd be interested in knowing more how it fits into this history, is phenomena of Christian-Muslim hybridity, what we might call local religious belonging. I'm thinking in particular in the Ottoman context. My research is in Cyprus, where a community of people affiliated both with Christianity and Islam, circumcised and baptized, speaking multiple languages, engaging in multiple marriage rites, etc., thrived for hundreds of years. But thinking with you about how Christian-Muslim relations are informing one another, I think it's really striking how this community comes to be increasingly despised and marginalized by both, and both communities working together to marginalize those who are participating in this form of hybridity. So I wonder if you speak further to that as part of the history you're bringing out.
So, fascinating topic, extremely important. Many, as you say, many hybrid groups, sometimes you'll see them called crypto-Christians, crypto-Jews. You don't hear the term crypto-Muslims, but I think it should, you can throw that out there too. Interestingly, in the late 19th century, the Muslim authorities, influenced by Christian missionaries, began to decide that groups that tended to be, that were ambiguous, should be Muslim. And so they initiated a Muslim missionary movement, which attempted to bring groups like the Alawites and the Yazidis and the Druze into mainstream Islam, and that then ended up stimulating uprisings and resistance movements and so on. And we can see the legacies of that today. So, and then of course, then you get into the 20th century, and governments gain control over textbooks, and governments take control over religious instruction in schools. And it's at that moment when people have to really definitively say what they are, if they're Christian or Muslim, and then of course the Jews end up leaving from the area as well. So that tolerance for religious hybridity on the official level becomes, it starts to disappear in the 20th century and create more polarization.
Also related to these hybrid groups, there's also just even non-hybrid shared spaces, which disappeared. That is, there's all these shrines where Jews, Christians, Muslims, various types of Jews, Christians, and Muslims all are gone.
Instead of just being replaced with minarets, shrines that people there's oral history about, but then you go to the place and there's a physical structure
then, of course, this is all different from the much later emergence of groups like Muslim believers in Christ. Some of whom in the late 20th century start to call themselves that because they need to emphasize their Muslim identification in order to avoid, or to try unsuccessfully to avoid a degree of state persecution. And then anthropologists, especially in the early 21st century, have studied the Muslim practice. It's not a reciprocal Christian practice of going to Muslim spaces as much, but common Muslim practice of going to Christian sites in places like Istanbul and Muslims visiting Christian shrines. But actually, there are others. Angie can also speak to that in Egypt.
There was one question.
Question for Professor Sharkey. How do you see the situation and future for Palestinian Christians?
I didn't raise that example in the case study, but in the discussion, but it follows this general pattern: steep decline in the numbers of Christians, whether they were living as religious minorities, whether in Muslim states or in a Jewish state like Israel. It's just not as congenial to be living as a religious minority in a different religious majoritarian state. So the numbers are set to continue to decline not through conflict or forced expulsion, but just through steady low-grade emigration where opportunities present themselves.
Thank you for this presentation. I'm kind of thinking about Eda's lecture. It's possible for me to take exactly everything you have said and compose it on the Nigerian situation, other Nigeria, and contribute to that. So for me, I begin to raise issues relating to constitutionality. And I'm trying to see why, as a Nigerian or as an African, I'm beginning to take certain positions on the state of Christianity in the world that is related to my scholarship, but at the same time it is not. So the question for me is that what is the responsibility of a scholar? Particularly a scholar who defines himself as a Christian in the context of the crisis that we are going through. Fast forward to America, and let's go to Harvard. It was not difficult for Harvard to raise a lot of money from the Middle East to establish what they call our chair. There are about 6 of them. I succeeded in getting one from them for the School of Divinity for Christianity, for Islam in Africa. If a Christian philanthropist comes with that same body of money, that you know what, I want us to create Christianity in a non-European context at Harvard will say, hey, what are you talking about? So what does that mean to us? So as a result of these kinds of things we're talking about, the activities relating to the study of Islam, it's virtually so much on that campus. So it is hard for me as a Nigerian, as an African who is in this country, who is going through this type of issue, to be very quiet. So the question intellectually and academically is that, what is our responsibility as scholars to the community we belong to? And I'm not an evangelical Christian, I'm pretty liberal. My daughter as well. I'm very, very liberal. So how do I, I'm going to argue. So to make sure I'm doing the right thing.
So really difficult question. I have a couple of thoughts. So first, part of the money a large part of the money that has gone into the expansion of the study of Islam in American universities has connections to histories of Orientalism and American defense interests. So there's a sort of a sinister Islamophobic impulse in some ways behind support for Islamic studies, some of it. And Dana Robert has discussed the decline and discrediting of mission studies and the historical reasons for why Christianity became less acceptable. We were talking about that last night before dinner. When I worked on my second book, my former PhD advisor told me that writing about evangelicals might destroy my career, might ruin my credibility as a scholar by writing about Christians. So there's that impulse behind it. But then in terms of your question about what is the responsibility of the scholar, I don't have any answers about the responsibility of scholars towards the Middle East. But I have thoughts about the responsibility of scholars towards the United States, because this is my home. And my responsibility as I try to live it is to teach in a way that respects the diversity of my students, and that considers them like members of one family, one community, and therefore to respect the plurality and diversity of backgrounds and cultures and traditions that they come from, and to reach a point when we can study a history like the history of the Middle East, which can be so fraught, and to try to do it in a mutually respectful, caring, and productive way that enables us at the same time not to avoid difficult questions, but to confront and try to talk through them. So this issue of responsibility, I don't know for the Middle East, but for here, I think we can try to model the kind of society that we want to have in our own midst through the university.
Something in response to what you just said would be this. First of all, I'd say peace be upon you. To promote the diversity of everyone in whatever people believe. The problem is if someone believes wrongly, there's a real hell, there's a real judgment day coming. Okay? And we know that by the fact that we see injustices in this world. People are vandalized, they're killed, right? And so by the fact that we see injustices, that of itself, if we hold to God being a just God, is evidence that there's a judgment day coming. So to promote that, well, you could just continue on in what you're doing, and you do what you're doing, and you do what you're doing. While I agree we shouldn't force people into what is truth, we should not, if we know something is wrong, encourage them into what's wrong.
I'm not from a theological seminary, I'm from a history department. And so my role is to teach history. And my role is not to correct people or to lead them to religious truth.
Question for Dr. Becker. You left a question hanging out at the very end that was really intriguing to me. And so I didn't know if you had any speculations on it, given that you raised it. And the question of the connection between this kind of growth of secularity and growth of this some sort of understanding of global Christianity. I don't know if you have any initial thoughts on that. I found it intriguing.
I think I have too many thoughts, but I'm probably just repeating it in a way what I was saying, but I think if we can, and this relates to the question I think I asked Professor Kwok this morning, that is there something in the term global that we can kind of identify as that this is distinct about when we talk about Christianity today, as opposed to just saying, okay, global, Christianity is all over the place. It's always been all over the place. So what? Then Christianity's always been global. Why call it global? Just call it Christianity. That there is something distinctive in the modern period in the way religion unfolds and the way that it exists within vis-a-vis various what we call secularities. That is the decline of religion or the submitting of religion, politics, economics. That's at least imagined by some people, and that people can actually talk about, and put it most simply, people can talk about religion as religion. And as Christianity is labeled a religion, and then there's world religions, and then people identify as a religious person or a not religious person. All those issues, which then are personal issues about ourselves, but also political issues and institutional issues, because governments and everything else, and the international legal order. So all these things are different about, and it has an effect on Christianity and its limits. And then also there's contestations around that, right? Some people would say that, okay, Christianity is more than just some private thing, and then there's a fight around that. So that whole fight around the binary of the religious and the secular may say something about this modern phenomenon of global Christianity. And then you can see the boundaries shifting. So for example, the Pentecostalization of the church, at least the little I've read about it, is there's also political effects. There's like questions about political theology and its relationship to the state. So all that, you don't have any of that complexity, I think, in the pre-modern period. I mean, there's different complexities, but it's just not that complex. Once religion is named religion and spoken about as this thing, it changes religion. And that is what I was suggesting with regard to the law.
Yes, Professor Hall.
I want to engage with Dr. Becker because the topic is of interest to all of us. The global, because you mentioned that Christianity has always had this global imagination. Matthew 25, we can make disciples in all nations. And then, so many of us grew up thinking that Jews is an ethnic religion. Christianity global, because then it broke through these confines of the Jews and then to the Gentiles. And our colleague Denise Bill wrote this book, Why This New Race? Contesting. No, you look at the Greek fathers. In fact, they had to construct a new race, Christians, vis-a-vis the Jews, the Romans, and the Greeks to define who they are. So it is not that they are disembodied, which you mentioned earlier. So I was wondering whether in Syrian Christianity or in Iraq Christianity, there was other imagination about the group. The Syrian missionaries were the first who went to China, for example. So did they envisage a group that's quite different from the Greeks or the Romans?
With regard to the Denise Buell's book, I mean, what she's doing there is basically saying Christians are looking for a way to talk about social groupings and kind of metaphorize the social genera to talk like, so what was she? Christians are like a third race. I think is what she's thinking this from. I forget, second century apologist. So what? I think I'm going to answer this circuitously. That is that something I thought about from Professor Roberts' talk in the beginning. The issue of the imagination of the global and how with the development of academic missiology, there were maps and certain statistics. And I was thinking about, when we spoke about this, that at the mission that I worked on, in the mid-19th century, they had a globe. And they brought this globe to Iran, and they were showing the locals, and they had maps, like color-coded maps, which reminded me of my childhood of Cold War maps with there was red and there was green or whatever the distinctions were. But I was thinking about, on the one hand, yes, Christianity is always global because it says go to the ends of the earth and go forth, divert people. But on the other hand, there may be different notions of the global, different imaginings of the global in different mission settings. So I was thinking about how this being there with a globe and maps and getting together the whole community as they do at the mission I work on, and having everyone once a month engage in a concert of prayer where you're praying for the conversion of all the nations. And they thought, at least, that everyone else around the world on that same day, I think the first of the month or something like that, everyone around the world is praying at the same time. And they're praying at the same time for the various nations. So the people all at the mission in Iran are all there as Syrians, thinking of themselves as, we're a nation, we're praying for these other nations. And they have a globe there, and they're looking at the globe. That's a really different object of mission than what we have in, say, the Nestorian mission of the Middle Ages. And they're thinking the four corners of the earth, they're thinking the earth's flat, actually. And it's a very different globe. So it's an issue of continuity and discontinuity. The Christians are obviously fulfilling a certain mission, but if we look at it really closely, like what is it that they see themselves doing? And there's something very secular, modern, materialistic about this 19th century onward mission, where they're objectifying the world and imagining it from above in ways that it was rather, let's go over there, when the Syrians are traveling across Asia converting people. Sorry for the long answer.
So we have arrived at the end of this session. I would like to thank both speakers again for the thought-provoking papers.